What if Elton John was a pub rocker? That's the question we'll be asking ourselves on this week's What If, How, When, Why. Hi, my name is Morgan Brown, and every Monday I upload a new What If video to my YouTube channel. The idea of these videos is that every week I pick a different popular song and imagine an alternative universe in which some change of circumstances causes that song to come out completely different from the version that we know and love. I then take the original lead vocal of that song and record a new backing track to it using just GarageBand and whatever instruments I happen to have to hand in order to bring that alternative version of the song to life. The song I picked this week was Saturday Night's Alright for Fighting by Elton John, and I tried to reimagine that as a pub rock song, so if you haven't had a chance to listen to that yet, here's a little taster. It's funny how the idea for this week's video came to me. I must confess that as well as being a massive music nerd, I'm also, for my sins, a pretty big pro wrestling fan. And one of my great pleasures and ways to relax is to sit watching wrestling with the commentary on headphones whilst playing the guitar. And one of the shows that I watch is AEW Collision, and the theme tune for that is Saturday Night's Alright for Fighting. So for some months I've been sitting watching this show, playing along with the theme on guitar, idly running over in my mind different ideas for what I could do with the song. So definitely got AEW Wrestling to thank for the fact that this week's video exists. Growing up as a kid, I was pretty convinced that I didn't like Elton John at all. I think just being the age I am, I grew up right when he kind of hit his 80s period, and my initial impression of him was just the guy who just does the interminable ballads with the twinkly electric piano. And I guess by the time I was really paying attention to pop music, we were hitting the point where Elton was recording things like Sacrifice, which was, I think, #1 for quite a while in the UK. It certainly seemed to be pretty inescapable for a while, and I hated it. Just couldn't get with it at all. I thought it was terribly dull, and the way he sang just really put me off as well. Turning the word sacrifice into 6 syllables just seemed ridiculous. And I'm still not a fan of that era of his work, to be honest, but I think that's more a symptom of the way popular music went in the 80s than particularly anything that Elton's to blame for. As far as singing goes, over the years, although he kind of started out already with a fairly convoluted American accent, as many singers of his generation from the UK did, I do feel like it maybe became a bit more of a caricature of itself as the years went by, to the point where by the 90s he very much sounded like Vic Reeves' club singer from Shooting Stars. That's a reference that no one outside the UK will understand, but if you just search on YouTube after watching this, Vic Reeves' club singer, you'll understand what I mean. It did kind of go a bit that way. All of which is to say that initially, as a kid, wasn't a huge fan of Elton's music, but obviously as I grew a little bit older, I heard a bit more stuff. You start to hear some of the earlier records, some of his stuff from back in the 70s, and as I heard more of that, and also as I matured a little bit and my taste got a bit broader, I kind of realised that far from being just this slick one-trick pony balladeer, there's a lot more going on in his music. Certainly back on those 70s records, there's all kinds of quite cool influences in there, from a lot more kind of rootsy stuff. You can hear bits of soul, you can hear country in there. There's also a lot more stuff that rocks. And then later on, reading up about his background, that stuff kind of makes a lot more sense when I realised that from quite a young age, he was one of the founding members of Bluesology, London blues and R&B collective, who backed up loads of these legendary visiting American artists, and then later became Long John Baldry's permanent backing band. So I had no idea for the longest time that he'd actually been such a sort of important part of that 1960s British R&B scene, and that to me explains blends a lot more some of these rootsier influences that you hear in those 70s records particularly. He was working behind the scenes for quite a long time, both backing other singers, and also I think there's a bunch of those Top of the Pops compilation albums kicking around where it was the hits of the day performed by faceless session musicians, and Elton, or Reg as he was back in those days, is playing session piano on quite a few of those records too. He ended up going for a job as a staff writer at Derek James Music, got paired up with Bernie Taupin, who obviously became his lifelong collaborator. Eventually he was persuaded to, instead of just writing for other people, to actually sort of cut some of his own songs. And when he did finally make a record, kind of emerged pretty much fully formed as an artist. I mean, those early singles and the first album, the production maybe dates them a little bit, but otherwise in terms of the songwriting, it's already right there on the level of all those kind of classic mid-70s records. And from there on, it's a heck of a run of records all the way through the first half of that decade, certainly. I'm not a fan of everything, but although I can appreciate the artistry that goes into these things, some of the ballads kind of lose me a bit. I could definitely live without hearing Candle in the Wind again, even the Sandy Denny version, and I love Sandy Denny. But there's definitely some good stuff there too. And yeah, just before I made this video, I was just having a bit of a listen through the Goodbye Yellow Brick Road album, and just thinking how far removed it is from my initial impression of Elton John from those 80s singles when I was a kid. When I finally eventually heard Saturday Night's Alright for Fighting, it was quite a revelation to me, because it's just quite the opposite end of the spectrum from what I'd initially thought of his music as being. Just a great, big, brash rock and roll record. I guess you could mainly place it in the glam rock idiom, more or less. It's certainly in the same ballpark as something like Suffragette City by Bowie, a fairly close cousin to a bunch of Stones records from around that time too. But it's also got this big Leon Russell, Joe Cocker, Mad Dogs the Englishman kind of show band thing to it as well, with this kind of larger than life production, the big horn section and everything. And the lyrics, like Bernie Taupin's lyrics, are fun too. I like the way it's got that contrast between this big sort of brassy, arena-filling rock production and then this really grimy, down-to-earth, grubby British night out depicted in the lyrics. It was an interesting contrast. I guess the idea that I had with this week's music video was, instead of having the song based on that contrast, how about if we take away the contrast and make a musical setting that exactly reflects the lyric of the song? So the obvious way to do that seemed to me to be to turn to pub rock. Now, I have touched on pub rock in these videos before. I think I definitely talked about it a bit in the Sex Pistols / Chas and Dave video a while ago, but it's an important thing, and I think it bears taking another slightly closer look at, because it's a movement that can tend to be a bit overlooked in Britain's music history, but it really was a massive catalyst for change in the 1970s music landscape. If you look at the early 70s UK rock and pop scene, you can see a lot of the rock bands who've been coming up through the late 60s getting bigger and bigger, moving away from their club roots, becoming arena rock acts like Led Zeppelin. The bands who came up through the psychedelic scene expanding into progressive rock, getting these ever more elaborate setups, more elaborate stage shows, again, moving into these huge kind of arena settings. There's also glam rock happening, which is musically a bit more down to earth, but not everyone's going to be into the show and the pageantry and the artifice of it. So there's a real gap in the market for people who just want down to earth, gritty, authentic, accessible music. I think at the time there was a bit of a dearth of grassroots music venues as well. Not that many places where you could just go out, spend a small amount of money and see a band in a small room, a bunch of up-and-coming performers who want to get out and play, want to build a following, but there's nowhere for them to do it. So they start looking outside of traditional rock and pop venues just to try and find somewhere to go and hone their craft, somewhere to build an audience. And the solution that they find is a bunch of these London pubs, pretty big, spacious Victorian pubs. A lot of them have back rooms that weren't particularly being used or whatever, just a bit of an untapped resource. I think pub culture in the UK is completely unrecognisable for the most part now from how it would have been back in the early 70s. Probably in those days, a lot of pubs were still relics from World War II times, these dingy kind of smoke-filled places, no young people, just a bunch of middle-aged and old fellas going to have a drink and escape from their wives kind of thing. It's a stereotype, but I think it's probably based in reality too. So there was wasn't really much happening in pubs at the time, and the idea of actually having live music in them, aside from maybe just someone playing old sing-alongs on the piano, was quite a groundbreaking idea. So through the early 70s, this circuit develops round these assorted London pubs, and the bands that are playing there are a mixture of people who are already active in the music scene going back into the 60s, but who found some of the musical developments of the later 60s to be a bit pretentious or unappealing and just wanted to keep doing the music they were doing. And alongside these old hands, a bunch of new people coming through who didn't identify what was currently going on in the chart music scene, in the arena rock scene, and prog rock, and just wanted to play something a bit raw and real as well. A little buzz kind of develops around this scene. Young people suddenly flocking to pubs, and the music press cottons onto this, like, what's going on here? It was really a much needed antidote to what was happening in mainstream music at the time. Not everyone wants to have to save up their wages for weeks and weeks to go and see Led Zeppelin or whoever half a mile away playing 40-minute drum solos, when you can just go round the corner to some little pub and see a great band up close and personal playing this kind of raw, exciting music. It just kind of offered a much more immediate, much more intimate, much more kind of visceral experience than anything else in the rock scene at the time. Probably the most prominent band to come out of that early scene would have been Dr. Feelgood, who kind of become emblematic of the movement, and it's generally sort of their sound that people think of when you mention pub rock. Pared down, sped up, raw, blues and R&B, harking back to the Stones and the Yardbirds early days, but just given this extra edge of menace and speed freak aggression. Operating in a very similar sort of field, you also had the Pirates, who had recently reformed. The Pirates, in their 1970s incarnation, had actually been the second version of Johnny Kidd's backing band, the great early British rock and roll singer. So they'd already been a really vital part of British rock back in the 1960s, helping to create some of the first really credible kind of British rock music. But then with this rising tide of down-to-earth guitar music, they reformed, and Mick Green, their lead guitarist particularly, was massively influential on the generation of punk guitarists that followed immediately. So I guess people tend to think of pub rock mainly as this turbocharged R&B, but actually when you look back at the scene, there was a whole bunch of different stuff going on, quite a diversity of different musical styles, just united by the fact that they were presented in a much more down-to-earth and raw and honest, unpretentious fashion than a lot of the rest of the music that people could find elsewhere in the scene. So you have, on the one hand, the likes of Chili Willy and the Red Hot Peppers doing country-ish stuff. I guess you'd probably call it Americana nowadays. The likes of Brinsley Schwartz, who edged into power pop. People like Rugulator, who had kind of a funk edge to them. Kilburn and the High Roads, who were massively influential, going on to spawn Ian Dury and the Blockheads, and also who featured Nick Cash from 999, the great punk band as well, who mixed all kinds of different influences in there. So it wasn't just one sound, it was a really pretty diverse and interesting scene. And that whole ethos of stripping away the pretension and artifice, going back to basics, but then adding a new energy and drive, was such an obvious catalyst for the punk movement, which emerged in 1976. But unfortunately, the arrival of punk kind of wiped out pub rock, immediately made that wave of bands seem a bit old hat, a bit dated, and a bit irrelevant. Some of the pub rock bands definitely managed to adapt and just become assimilated into punk. I mean, Eddie and the Hot Rods, who'd started out as pretty much a straight ahead R&B band, with very minimal adjustment, got accepted into punk, and a few of the other first generation punk bands were essentially pub rockers who just put some bondage pants on, basically, like the Vibrators, 999, who I mentioned before. Even the Clash, I mean, Joe Strummer had been in the 101ers, who were absolutely a pub rock band, and took a lot of that style forward into his new band. A bunch of the bands did survive through that one way way or another they either adapted to it or just kept ploughing their own furrow and still carried on doing okay. I mean, Dr. Feelgood continued to have a fair bit of success, and indeed, in spite of many lineup changes, just ploughed right on through. And I think they're still going in some form, although it's been many years since they've had any original members in. But because it was overshadowed by punk rock, the pub rock scene never quite got the critical acclaim it necessarily deserved. I think also possibly the name doesn't really help it. I think just that term pub rock implies a certain amount of grimy dowdiness, which just doesn't seem cool. There's a cultural cachet still to claiming that you're a punk, but if you say you're a pub rocker, somehow it just sounds a bit dowdy and blokey. I don't know, it's a shame that it didn't get a punchier name, because it really was a pretty groundbreaking, exciting and musically diverse scene, and definitely deserves a bit more respect than it tends to get. So that takes me to this week's alternative universe scenario. So in my alternative timeline, we're going back to 1973. In this universe, instead of having a breakthrough and starting to make his own records in the late 60s, Elton John has become a staff writer at DJM, but then he's just carried on doing that. He's not managed to make his own breakthrough as a performer, and he's getting a bit frustrated by this. He explains the reason for his depression to Bernie Taupin, and they decide to just go and drown their sorrows. They're going to go out for a drink in this North London pub that they frequent. For some reason, everything's a little bit more lively than usual there. It's normally pretty quiet, but there's a bunch of young people hanging around outside, a bit of a buzz of excitement. So they go in to check it out, and it turns out that the reason this new crowd is in is because Ducks Deluxe are playing. So they go and check it out, and so excited to see this band playing in this sweaty little room with this really avid crowd, and the music's really high energy and raw and harks back to all this great stuff that they haven't heard for years. Elton's really inspired, so he goes back to his band that he's formed to try and get his career off the ground. Makes a few changes to the set. They dispense with all the ballads and just keep the rockers, add a few more in. Adjusts everything so everything is in this sort of tight driving R&B style. And then he makes his debut on the pub circuit, soon becomes a popular fixture there, and eventually comes to the attention of Chiswick Records, who sign him up, and he starts making records with them, including his pub rock anthem, Saturday Night's Alright for Fighting. So he never achieves the massive mainstream success that he did in this timeline over there, but does become a formative influence on the punk generation. So, in attempting to turn Saturday Night's Alright for Fighting into a pub rock song, as ever, the first thing I do is just take the vocal and drop it into GarageBand, get it synced up to the grid. It's already pretty up-tempo, but I decided I really wanted to push that tempo, because you just want that really wild, slightly off-the-hook energy, so crank the speed up a bit. Pop some drums on, just trying to keep it pretty tight and in the pocket, nothing too fancy. I was listening to what the Big Figure did on those great old Dr. Feelgood records, so nothing too showy, just really hard driving, tight, punchy drums. Bass-wise, again, nothing too fancy, a nice kind of full tone. So some of the time we're just hammering along on eighth notes on the root note, and then some of the time got a little kind of walk going on as well, just to change things up. And then guitar-wise, I had to rein myself in, because I normally love to put thousands of guitars on these things. One guitar track, using my Telecaster, which is kind of a classic pub rock guitar, unpretentious. Just gave it a sound that's just breaking up a little bit. It's not full on, hard rock distortion. And I tried to go for a bit of a Wilco Johnson from Dr. Feelgood style. He always played with his hand in this kind of claw shape and just hammering down with his fingers. I couldn't make that work for me at all. So I played with a pick, but tried to maintain that sort of regular eighth note downstroke, so you've got this constant rhythm going, even if you're playing a little bit of lead. Then I thought, because it's Elton, I've got to have some piano on there. So did my best to just give it a bit of a Jerry Lee Lewis kind of hammering rock and roll piano. I'm a terrible, terrible keyboard player, so I just just bashed through it as best I could, and then spent a very long time going back through the MIDI file and moving all the notes back to where they should have been. And then as a final touch, I just added a little bit of harmonica. I didn't mix it too high because, I mean, to be honest, it's not a particularly good performance. I don't have a harmonica in the right key for the track, so I had to just play along to just the drum track, looking at the screen to see where the vocal was to try and fit around it, and then pitch shift it into key. So it's a little bit hit and miss, but it's another texture in there. It's another nice R&B sort of flavour. And then for the video, as ever, started out by trying to find a decent contemporary clip of Elton doing the song back in the 70s. In the clip, he's playing in a pretty big theatre or auditorium, so I tried to cut as much of that out as possible and just zoom in on him. So I wanted to suggest that he's actually playing in one of these sweaty little pub venues. And then instead of Elton's own backing band, I've borrowed Dux Deluxe to be his backing group, so like some really cool footage of Dux Deluxe back in the early 70s. And so we've got them in there too. And then some archive footage of old British pubs as well, just to give a bit of a sense of that environment too. And as a final touch, as I usually do, I just mocked up a few posters to place Elton John and his band in that scene and that time frame as well. So I hope you enjoyed this. It's a funny one. When I'd actually finished making this, I realised it's one of the less dramatic transformations of a song that I've done, because it's already a pretty rocking song. I mean, I know there are some people who consider Saturday Night's Alright for Fighting to be a kind of proto-punk song as it is, so maybe it's not the most dramatic transformation, but I kind of feel like it came out sounding like what it was supposed to be. So hopefully you agree with me and you enjoyed it. Let me know what you think down in the comments, and if you did enjoy it, please like and subscribe. That always really helps. If there's anything you'd like me to do in coming weeks and months, any songs or artists or genres you'd like me to take a look at, do let me know. But otherwise, that's all from me for this week, so thanks very much indeed for watching, and I will see you next time.